Thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Write Project podcast and radio program. This is a show about writing and modern Newfoundland author culture. This program is produced and recorded at CHMR FM 93.5 FM in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, and is aired on other great stations in the province and elsewhere in the country. It can also be heard online at www.chmr.ca. I'm your host, Matthew LeDrew, author of the Xander Drew series and founder at Engine Books. Let's see what we have today. Well, thank you so much for joining us for another spectacular episode of the Write Project podcast. I know I say they are all spectacular, but this one really is. Every other episode is trash. We're on with Greg Cox, the New York Times best-selling author of my entire childhood, it seems. He's got a bunch of novels like The Rise and Fall of Khan Noonien Singh, The Q Continuum, Captain to Captain, The Librarians and the Lost Lamp, the Gamma Quest Trilogy, Batman Court of Owls. He does novelizations of comic books like Infinite Crisis, Final Crisis, 52, and novelizations of films like Daredevil, Man of Steel, and all the Underworld movies, from what I can see there. Just an amazing, prolific writer in the industry. Thank you so much for honoring us with your presence, Mr. Cox.
Oh, no problem. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, first of all, the reason I invited you on was I've been getting more bold with who I ask as guests. For a long time, I'm a small writer myself with a smaller career, but I was inviting people in my circle onto the show. And then I was branching out aside my circle locally, and then I've been pushing more and more there. And you were on my list for a while because you are actually the author that got me to read novels. The first ones when I was a child. So like the Gamma Quest trilogy from Marvel Comics, which I have all of here, like a giant nerd. I was big into comic books. That's how my parents got me to read, like a lot of people. And they got me your novels when they wanted to transition me and be like, hey, keep reading comics, but let's see if we can get you into novels. So it went from your books into Black Stallion and Goosebumps and then into headier stuff. But you were my gateway drugs into novels, and now I can't seem to stop reading novels and writing novels. So thank you, first of all, very much for a lifetime in literature.
You're welcome, and I'm sorry. Okay, but
funny stuff. We do an episode of like what was the first book you remember, novel you remember reading, and about 30% of the time it's yours. It's one of your like a lot of people locally had that experience of. I was reading comics because there was a big comic book scene here. And then my parents got me a novel by Greg Cox. And it was either, the Daredevil novelization, because I like that movie, or this, or that. But you, despite probably never having been to Newfoundland, had a profound effect on the local writing community in Newfoundland, Canada, as odd as that is, and probably sounds.
I know, actually, honestly, that's actually seriously cool. I will be bragging about this to my girlfriend afterwards. And yeah, and it actually is, I'm being sincere, kind of moving and touching to realize, because, oh my God, I have my own memories of growing up and summer vacations and the books that hooked me to read. Wow, sort of, to find myself in that position is honestly, generally kind of touching,
I'm glad.
And that's the kind of thing that keeps you going on the days when you're fighting deadlines and contracts and where the hell is that royalty check and whatever. But, kind of reminds you why you started doing this,
For sure. If it's okay with you, I had some questions about those books in particular, like, and what it's like to write in that what's the word, genre or type of writing or stuff like that. So specifically with the Gamma Quest books, which I'm not going to go in on because like they're my love, but everyone listening will be like, what? You know what I mean? Like, because
I reprinted recently. They were reprinted as an omnibus edition. That kind of surprised me because I thought they were sort of,
yeah.
Not going to day again,
No, since the Disney takeover, I've noticed they've been reinvigorating what I call the MNU, the Marvel Novelization Universe, which is like they've been doing it as audio dramas. Like you can actually get an audio book of Gamma Quest now, and they've got sound effects in it with like pow and zap and all that weird stuff. It's crazy.
They did that with my Iron Man books too. Yeah,
They did. They absolutely did. The Operation AIM books. Yeah. Which I never got a chance to read, and now I'm going to because I've got Audible credits. I'm like, bam. But I remember reading this and then reading the Times Arrow books by DeFalco that were kind of set around the same. Again, just another like X-Men novelization book. And your book references that as though like it's in the same continuity, which it is, of course. I want to talk a bit about that experience and what it's like to write, because when you're writing these novels, you're writing based on the current continuity of the comics, but you can't really affect continuity. Like if you kill off a character, or well, first of all, you can't, but like even if you did, it's not like they're going to reference that in the main books. Peter David has a wonderful, Incredible Hulk novel that came out around that time called What Savage Beast, where the Incredible Hulk has a son, and I imagine that it was his desired end to his run on Hulk, but Marvel, for whatever reason, just didn't want to do that. So now it's over here in this novel. Does it count? Does it not? I wanted to ask you about what that experience is like writing with all the constraints, but none of the benefits of continuity, and how you do that, basically. How does that feel? Positives, negatives, whatever.
Well, to a certain degree, you want to reflect the current comic books as they're being written. But honestly, my philosophy also is that you're not going to get too specific into what's going on. I have two philosophies there. One is you have to assume that the people who are picking up the novel have maybe not necessarily been reading the last year and a half of X-Men. So I'm going to stay away from whatever the current arc plot is. There's a certain degree where you kind of go for the archetypal, version of that. There's also just in terms of lead times. By the time you get your novel approved, you write it, it gets published, you're talking 9-10 months. So it's like, okay, I'm not going to be tying into, currently in the storyline right now, Gambit has lost his powers. I'm just ignoring that.
Yeah.
I remember I did a Fantastic Four book some years later. And I remember when I was writing it, they were going through some plot line where the FF had switched powers. So it's suddenly Johnny could turn invisible and whatever. And I just ignored that because honestly, I safely assume that a year and a half from now, when my book hits the stands, the powers will all have been sorted out again. Yeah. Plus, again, the assumption that you got two audiences. You got the people who, yes, are going down every Wednesday and buying their comic book. But there are all people who kind of know about the FF. They see the Fantastic Four, the X-Men book on, and they have some knowledge of it, but they're not, again, you want to kind of keep, I think of it as the airport reader who sees the book at the airport, gift shop and reads it, I remember even on the FF book, because nowadays you have to deal with that. You've got the audiences that kind of know the characters mostly from maybe the media versions.
Yeah.
And even though technically you may be doing the comic book version, you don't want to make your books completely inaccessible.
Yeah.
Again, I remember on the FF book, and the FF book came out around the time that the Jessica Alba, Chris Evans movies came out. And yeah, they weren't officially tie-ins, but there's not a coincidence that we were putting the books out. Gee, this book is landing the same month that Rise of the Silver Surfer is coming out, So I had to keep in mind again that, okay, there's the actual comic book, but a lot of people are just kind of do the sort of archetypal versions of the characters. I remember in that case, there was the issue that in the comic books, Reed and Sue had 2 kids, whereas they weren't actually married in the movies yet. How I handled that was shamelessly, I wrote the 2 kids, Franklin and Valeria, out in the first chapter. Yeah. Here they are. Yes, they have kids, but don't worry about them. They're going off to visit Aunt Alicia, and you're not going to see them again the rest of the book.
Yeah.
And that's the same sort of thing with, the Gamma Quest is just sort of keeping one eye on the actual comics and trying to do the archetypal version of the story characters. And it is kind of weird sometimes, like, okay, we're never going to acknowledge your books, but you can't contradict our comic books. I remember I wanted to use the Mandarin at one point, one of my Iron Man books. And, no, we've got a big plot line with the Mandarin coming up, so you can't use the Mandarin. So, okay, whatever. So I couldn't use them. But there is this give and take. My other funny story, I remember when I did Gamma Quest, which for those who don't know was an Avengers X-Men crossover. I remember I was told I could use any 6 X-Men as long as one of them was Wolverine.
Makes sense.
So, and I remember there were negotiations again on the Avengers. I remember I actually we had the conversations with my editor, Keith DeCandido, who's also a well-known tie-in writer, that he, at that time in the comic books, there were a couple of young new Avengers. There was Firestar, and there was whatever Vance Astrovic's name was. I can't remember.
Justice.
That was it. And I remember Keith really lobbied for me to include them in the book, even to the extent of sending me a care package of a whole stack of old New Warriors comics, just so I would know who these characters were. But I admit, I dug in my heels because sort of like, no, these were, this is my one and only chance to write the Avengers. I'm going to write the Avengers I love. This is me point author preemptively, the Vision, the Scarlet Witch, the Beast, So despite Keith trying to twist my arm to bring in the new kids, I was like, and again, I wasn't like I'm bringing in a character who was dead or anything, but it was, but no, let me choose and I can now reveal this. I couldn't use Thor.
Really?
The publisher hated Thor. Just
wow.
Byron, who was the head of the packager, he thought Thor was that stupid guy with the hammer. I was told quietly under the table, don't even try submitting something with Thor. Byron's going to veto it. Okay. And yeah, people's preferences click in. I didn't want to use Firestar and Justice. Forgive me, Firestar and Justice fans out there, but they weren't the Avengers I grew up on. Byron apparently had an irrational dislike of Thor, so I was told quietly, Greg, just make life easy. Don't even bother using Thor. Okay.
And nowadays, now that the movies are like he's getting the fourth movie soon, they would bend over backwards for you to get Thor in there.
As I point out, I wrote all these books, the Avengers X-Men books back before, Robert Downey, Iron Man was a movie star. These books were in the 90s, back during the Clinton administration. So back when you were young and learning to read. So, so it's strange to realize that, I'm still kind of in shock that, oh my God, the Vision and Wanda now have their own TV series. Okay, which was,
which is
and tell Greg Cox, reading comic books at 7-Eleven back in the 70s, that one day Morbius the Living Vampire would have his own upcoming movie. I'd be like,
that a whole movie studio is
golden age here,
Yeah. That Morbius would have a movie that an entire studio is like banking its future on currently.
Even that we're all sort of, oh my God, it's Agatha Harkness is getting her own TV series.
Right.
Peggy Carter had her own TV series.
I would
just the big names like the Hulk or Spider-Man. We're getting into, we're getting Ant-Man 3,
Yeah.
And don't forget, Guardians of the Galaxy, for God's sakes. Blade, So we
in a lot of ways, these books, like just looking at the covers of them, it's that certain, I understand why they're reprinting them, because there's a big, 20-year rule nostalgia thing happening for Jim Lee's X-Men, the animated series, that era of X-Men. And this stuff really, at least from the covers, goes in with that. You got Rogue wearing that jumper with the two belts. You got that version of Wolverine. You know what I mean? Where it's no. Even on the new omnibus that they're putting out, it's Jim Lee art on it. That wasn't it's from the Bloodline saga from the comics, where it's Captain America and Rogue and them and Wolverine as they were drawn by Jim Lee. It's art from a different source.
I'm actually amused. The cover of the new edition, which is a nice Jim Lee drawing, doesn't feature Wolverine, which I find amusing because I was, of course, ordered to use Wolverine back in the 90s.
Definitely got to be on the back.
The covers on the original editions, I should point out, are by Julie Bell, and they are gorgeous covers, and they actually form a triptych. And it is, give Greg credit due, Julie Bell, beautiful covers on those old 90s editions. Okay,
There you go. Definitely. Wonderful stuff. Going around to more recent or switching gears a little bit, there's a lot of, I'm involved in the local Writers Alliance here, the Writers Alliance of Newfoundland and Labrador. A ton of recording, just in case this airs later. I'm the secretary on it. And we get a lot of questions sometimes that we're not able to answer. One of them being, how do I do what you're doing? Basically, people who are interested in writing adaptation, people who want to be a living writer. Yes, they probably have their own passion project, this novel they've been tinkering with for a decade or so, but they're man, I want to write the Star Trek novels that they put out every so often. I want to write X-Men novels. I want to write things where I at least hopefully there's a built-in audience for my stuff. Can you speak at all, and if you can't, we'll cut out that I asked you this, but can you speak at all to how that occurs? Like how...
Very good. In fact, I actually, like I said, like to talk about this because although it's hard not to be a bummer here, that it's the hard part is getting your foot
Be a
in the door.
bummer. Yeah.
The hard part, that's the tricky part. And there's a lot of misconceptions about the whole media tie-in world and how doing this license stuff. And I like to explain this because it actually breaks my heart. People come up to me at conventions, hi, I've written a 400-page Spider-Man novel. How do I get it published?
Yeah.
And my answer is, that's not how it works.
Yeah.
Basically, as I stretch, I do not wake up in the morning and decide, gee, I'm going to write a Warehouse 13 novel, and then somehow arrange to get it published by waving my magic publishing wand or sending it to somebody. These projects are not honestly generated by the writers. Almost all of my projects begin with me getting a phone call saying, hey, Greg, we've just acquired the license to the Librarians. What's your schedule like? And at this point, I'm in the enviable position, having been doing this since 1992, of being one of the usual suspects.
You are.
Now, how do you become one of the usual suspects? And this is where I always throw in the disclaimer that I did this like 30 years ago. So take this with a grain of salt because I did this back before blogs, YouTube, the internet. And I don't think there's a standard path for it. I think all of us find our way into it. No one goes to school and majors in novelization writing that I know of,
Maybe we should.
I did not get a degree in novelization writing. Mm-hmm. Usually, basically what you have is it's basically being in the right place at the right time. We all tend to have connections in publishing. We've written other books. We worked as editors. My story, because honestly, I came from the other side of the desk. I used to work 9 to 5. I was a full-time editor at Tor Books, which is a major science fiction publisher.
I'm very familiar with Tor Books, yeah.
In my capacity as a Tor editor, I actually did a lot of tie-ins. I edited, I started out on the other side of the desk, editing Farscape tie-ins and doing novelizations of God Help Me, Cutthroat Island and Mortal Kombat and Freddy Krueger, And gradually I kind of segged from being a full-time editor who wrote tie-ins on the side to being a full-time writer who honestly, I'm still a consulting editor for Tor Books and I still do a little editing on the side. And you get this just because it's a small kind of, dare I say, incestuous world. It's like, hey, Greg, you like vampires, right? Yeah, you're into vampires, right? Yeah. We just bought this thing, Underworld. Are you interested? What's your schedule like? And it's all the same people. The editor in question who calls me up and says, hey, Greg, we just bought this werewolf versus vampire thing. You're really into vampires, right? Because, I know you. This is my Star Trek editor who's saying this,
Yep.
And so he knows me and, gee, we got this vampire book. Well, let's call Greg. And that's the hard part, like I said, is just, and in the old days, it helped to be just sort of part of the crowd.
Yeah.
These days, and in my case, it helped that, honestly, I lived in New York. Yeah. And Tor Book offices were 2 blocks away from the Byron Price offices. Byron Price was a packager who did all those X-Men books. So we were all getting together and having lunch all the time. It was honestly, the Malibu Diner on 23rd Street, you would be amazed how many back in the day tie-in novels got hatched there because it was comic book day. It was across the street from this comic book shop. We'd all get together at the Malibu Diner, get our comic books and then sit around and talk, okay, so who's writing what? And,
That sounds super fun. I've heard that before. There was an author who worked on Ninja Turtles for a while, and he's actually a Newfoundlander. But when he got that gig, he was working in New York, and he's like, you don't understand. Here in Newfoundland, you go to the coffee shop, and there's a bunch of writers there, and it's the local writing scene. But in New York, you go to the coffee shop, and it's the global writing scene that are just sitting there having coffee together.
That being said, in these days of the internet and Zoom, look at you and me, we're talking here from Newfoundland to Pennsylvania, and people have blogs in the internet. I'm not sure it's as mandatory or as helpful to live in New York City and be part of the publishing community as it is back then. There are people who, basically the trick is, short version, you make a name for yourself by doing your own stuff, by being a well-known reviewer, by writing your own original novels, maybe being a well-known editor of Star Trek novels or something. And then the opportunities come to you, and one job leads to another.
Yep.
I did exactly, how did I get into my movie novelizations? It's because of those X-Men books, the Gamma Quest. But anyway, so yeah, what happened is, okay, a publisher got the rights to do the Daredevil novelization. Yeah. And this was an editor I'd not worked with before, but he asked around. He did those X-Men books, and he did those Iron Man books for Berkeley. In fact, Ginger Buchanan, who was one of my editors in that project, basically, oh, you're looking for somebody to do Daredevil? Well, what about Greg Cox? He does lots of superhero stuff. And I did Daredevil. And then once again, Greg does novelizations now. Bang, once you get your foot in the door. So it's like any career.
Yeah.
But the short version, like I said, just to get back, is the way not to do it is to sit down and write a 500-page Winona Earp novel and then somehow hope that you can get it sold somewhere, because you gotta have somebody who has a license. What happens is a publisher buys, does a deal to do Winona Earp novels, and then they look to line up the writers. They're not generated by the writers. And typically, for better or for worse, they're going to call people who have a track record and whom they've worked with before, who are reliable. And I will say this as being someone who has been on the other side of the desk and being an editor, and I need to have somebody write Farscape books. I need to have somebody write a Steel novelization for me. Reliable is almost more important than talent. Talent is good, but on movie tie-ins, they're big, they're trouble. You got to get the thing out in time for the movie. You got to deal with the studios. You want to eliminate these tend to be sort of stress-filled projects at the best of times, or tight deadlines. You're dealing with licensors. You want to eliminate the number of variables. So, I'm going to use John Betancourt. I'm going to use Yvonne Navarro. I'm going to use somebody I know and work with and had lunch with yesterday, who I know will deliver the book on time and will not. And who is a good team player. That's the thing. If you have lots of authorial ego and temperament, you may be the most brilliant writer in the world, but no, you can't touch obviously you're a novelization writer, you're writing novels based on somebody else's characters, be it Star Trek or Batman or the X-Men. You got to remember that you are a hired contractor.
Yeah.
I compared it I've been hired to build a deck on somebody's house to their specifications according to their budget. And because I take pride in my work, I will make the best deck I can. But ultimately, at the end of the day, if they tell me to, paint it green, I'll paint it green, or whatever. It's the copyright page says copyright CBS, copyright Marvel Comics. I am playing, I'm a hired contractor.
Yeah.
And these projects usually begin with me getting a phone call saying, "Hey, Greg, we just acquired a license to do Winona Earp novels. What's your schedule?"
Because if you're doing that, I know a few people are going to lose their darn minds.
Sadly, no. This is my hypothetical example. I would have loved to write, and of course, it helps. Of course, if you're a fan, like I said, Greg, you're into vampires. Let's get Greg. I did my very first tie-in project, which was a Batman thing, because Greg, people knew you're really into Batman and comic books, right? Well, DC needs a Penguin short story and they need it by next week. Can you do that? And bingo.
Yeah. Awesome.
I like to joke, I've been doing this since Michelle Pfeiffer was Catwoman.
That's fair. That you have. Yeah. Wow. Okay.
And I actually have a funny story about that. When I was working on the Dark Knight Rises novelization, I was out in California in Burbank and there was this very nice young woman who was working on Dark Knight Rises. And we got talking. She said, "Well, how long have you been doing this, Greg?" And I said, I've been writing Batman on and off since Michelle Pfeiffer was Catwoman. And she goes, "Wow, that was the year I was born."
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like I said, you get your foot in the door. I wrote a Penguin story in 3 days, and that's how I got my foot in the door, because the Batman Returns, the Tim Burton movie, was coming out, and I got word through the grapevine that DC desperately needed Penguin and Catwoman stories, and they needed them by Thursday. So I pulled a weekend, I pulled a couple all-nighters, and yay.
What I'm hearing is put yourself out there and be easy to work with.
Be easy to work with, be a good team player, and let people know that you're interested in this sort of stuff. And think, hi, I have my own successful series, but I'm a huge Star Trek fan. I would love to write a Star Trek novel too, or whatever.
Can I ask a very
And
specific?
like I said, nowadays you don't necessarily have to be at the Malibu Diner. You can, at a convention, chatting with somebody on YouTube, a Zoom meetings.
There you go.
You're a successful blogger.
Can I ask a very specific question if this would work? And if it doesn't, don't. You know what I mean? Like kind of thing. So locally, there's a divide between pitching fiction and pitching nonfiction. So locally, if you're to a local publisher, if you're pitching fiction, you're coming with the entire book and you're giving them the first 3 chapters. They're seeing if they like it, that kind of thing. If you're pitching nonfiction, you likely don't have it written yet. You're coming with the like an essay about what you want to accomplish with this book about diversity, and you're like, oh, I've got funding from this and here's my qualifications, and then once you get approved, you're writing the book. Is there any use to doing that, where it's like where you're putting in saying like, hey, before I sit down and spend 8 years writing this darn thing, I've got a pitch for a thing, send it off like you would locally for a nonfiction book? Or is that just a silly game to play?
I don't claim to be an expert on nonfiction here.
Yep.
I do know from talking to my agent that, especially in these, whatever times, that the days when you could sell, if you were a fiction novel, just on spec is harder. He much prefers to, have a full novel. Now, I should mention, this is not how tie-ins work. The way tie-ins work is, again, indeed, I've been spoiled here, honestly, in that I get a call from CBS, hey, Greg, we need a Star Trek novel for next July. What have you got? Typically, the way, because this stuff needs to be approved in advance, outlines are mandatory. They are part of the process. You write a 12-page window to outline, you submit it to the licensor, it comes back, you go back and forth, you make some tinkers, then you write the book, and then, the book, again, there's lots of back and forth, some minor tinkering, but almost always with the tie-ins, it's in fact pretty much mandatory, but before you even start writing, you need to get a 12-page outline approved. Awesome. That is not, I am told by my agent, the way non-tie-in fiction works. Excellent. In fact, like I said, I've been kind of spoiled. We've had this conversation, and I'm being very honest here that, well, why can't I just sell an original novel this way? Well, no, Greg, it's not like selling a Star Trek novel. If you want to sell an original novel, you pretty much have to write the whole thing, especially if you've never, in fact, it's all about track records. I don't act, my strange guilty secret, I've never sold an original novel. People ask me, so what about your original novels? I have been in the enviable position of being too busy writing Star Trek novels to actually find time to take out, 3 months out of my schedule, a year out of my schedule to write a book.
I would be lined up minute 1 for an original from you just to see what the heck that would be. Because
and like I said, I'm being very honest here. It's funny, people ask me, when are you going to write something original? And I don't want to whine here. This is a very good problem to have.
Yeah.
I will occasionally think about it. I have ideas. I have outlines full. And then, someone comes to me and say, hey, Greg, do you want to write a CSI novel? And I'm going, well, the roof needs repair and I got to pay off that dental bill. And, years go, my New Year's, suddenly, Greg. And again, I'm not complaining because, oh my God, I get to write a Planet of the Apes novel. I get to write a Godzilla novel. I get to write a Wonder Woman novel. My inner fanboy is thrilled, but consequently, again, I have been spoiled because, again, I can write a 12-page outline. And if I write a 12-page outline and it gets rejected, and this happens sometimes, we don't like this, start over. Like I said, trying to find time in my schedule but I've been told by my agent, who knows his business, that selling an original novel does not work. Like, you can't just write a 12-page Star Trek outline and get it approved and get a check, In fact, I will tell you that during the pandemic, things got a bit slow. I actually have written an original novel and it's out doing the rounds. And so it's a very weird situation because I've actually never been in a situation where I've had a book just floating around on spec. It's always been sort of, in fact, it's been rejected by one publisher. And this was weird because it was like, wow, I realized this is part of the writing experience. I've never actually had a novel rejected before. I've had outlines rejected, but it's always, usually it's a case of, like I said, they come to me and say, Greg, we want you to write a Star Trek novel. I write an outline and, I get paid before I start writing the book.
That's amazing.
This whole sort of, I write a book and I may or may not sell. I realize this is the standard, life of most 90% of all writers. It's like, this is so weird. I wrote a book and gee, I hope it sells.
All right, well, thanks for coming on again. For all of you, we'll be here again next week at 4:30 Newfoundland time or online at chmr.ca. Please tune in and we'll talk more about writing culture in Newfoundland.